Welcome back. I hope you had a nice, refreshing, very quick break. Thank you so much for being with us. And please join me in thanking Jeannie and Jerry for that really engaging conversation, and also for Christina for sharing her story with us. It's my pleasure now to bring before you to engage in another really wonderful conversation, Mariela, Jasmine, Moki, and Mary. I will turn it over to you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. I thank you so much, everybody. It's been a really insightful morning for me. I'm Mariela Ruiz-Angel. I'm the director of the Albuquerque Community Safety Department. This is a third branch to our public safety here in Albuquerque. So we are a department inside of city government. And previously, I was the coordinator for our Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, which I also started and then handed the torch off. I have the honor today to introduce our co-chairs. We had four wonderful, strong women. So Jasmine Desiderio, who is my deputy here at ACS, who also previously served as the project director of a Native American youth suicide prevention program. Moki Macias, the executive director of Policing Alternatives and Diversion, also known as PAD, and previously served as the instructor for the Region Public Health Training Center. And then Mary Nam serves as our crisis response design consultant for the PAD, right? Policing Alternative and Diversion Initiative, and previously supported the design, development, and implementation of the Transforming Power Fund's community-led grant making. So wonderful women that we got to work with. Love to go to the next slide. Similarly to the other committees, we had amazing work group. So as you can see here, we have two beautiful slides. I will say every single person that really participated committed time and just not just in our meetings, but on research. Many of these folks we got to know in other types of coalitions and planning that we're doing throughout our country. We can go to the next slide and give everybody a chance to see everybody. And similarly, I'd love to, go through all of them, but for sake of time. But yes, it was an amazing opportunity to get a chance to just hear from everybody and have some amazing experts who have been doing this for years and really were able to contribute to the conversation. So with all that said, I'm going to move it over to Moki to start kind of level setting for all of us today and letting you know what our group goals and scope was so that we can get going on this little journey together. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mariela. I appreciate you kicking us off here. And again, I want to just add my appreciation to Mariela's there, to the work group members that have been in really robust conversation with us over these months, and that I know we are going to continue putting to work in the interest of these recommendations. So I just want to spend a moment just to share with you where we landed on our scope. And our charge from the broader T911 group. So, as many of y'all have heard already from the Alternative First Responders work group, I just want to make that distinction there off the bat, just to say that really in thinking about the Alternative First Responders through 911, we're really talking there about the decisions that 911 telecommunicators are able to make, and then what responders are available to them, right? Now, with the Alternative Hotlines Working Group, we're really talking about, at the end of the day, what decisions community members are able to make about what number to call when they're in need, right? And significantly as well, what responses are available to them when they call hotlines that may not be 911, but do have similar purposes in responding to immediate emergent needs that community members are identifying. So that said, our goal was to assess the strengths and limitations of existing hotlines or crisis lines, that are aimed at ensuring similar services or alternate services such a, as 911 also is. And then to assess how hotline alternatives may reduce or may exacerbate bias and inequities that we are already, very well aware of, that occur in both our criminal legal systems and our health systems, right? And particularly what we know about the disparate impacts on Black communities and other communities of color. And then something that we added in along the way, which I want to lift up, because I think it is hopefully going to be a valuable tool, is a commitment to develop a self-assessment tool for hotlines to be able to gauge their own strengths and areas of improvement, that has been informed by looking at a pretty wide scope of different kinds of hotlines around the country and taking a look at some of the promising practices that are coming out of various communities. Next slide, please. All right, so our approach, I really want to appreciate the T911 staffers, if you will, of this whole process, as well as the researchers, both kind of the defined researchers on our work group, and also just many of the members were just, fonts of information and wonderful resources in that. So we benefited from a comprehensive lit review that were able to really kind of get us situated in terms of what the actual research says. And we're going to get to that a little bit more in a moment. But then we developed a rubric and key questions that helped us describe the different alternatives and what support they provided. And, it was interesting in our initial conversations because, for myself, I will say I was not even aware of the resources that are currently available in so many communities, whether that's from a national hotline that provides, really hands-on support and helps advocate for people to get into services or to get transportation. I mean, like really does so much, even just over the phone, right? All the way to much more localized numbers that may be completely separate from the existing centralized emergency response system, but are providing critical resources for folks that don't feel comfortable calling 911, right? So we had this huge range that we really needed to kind of organize. So it took us a while to try and organize that. And then we assessed some representative hotlines, so instead of doing a comprehensive review, which we really didn't have time for, frankly, we took sort of particular examples. And then we kind of went through this exercise to be able to identify, what was its strategic purpose vis-a-vis 911, right? What were the strengths, the pitfalls, limitations? And then given that, to what degree was this particular type of alternative hotline a viable and effective alternative to 911? And I think we learned a lot out of that process, which we're gonna, which I think shows up in the recommendations we're gonna share with you today. And then one of my favorite activities that we got a chance to do with the work group is to also present our ideas and our learnings to a group of experts, really, that were leading community-led efforts to provide response in their communities from places around the country, to just give us feedback on what they thought about how 911 worked in their community and what they were able to how they have been attempting to provide additional resources and how they want the system to keep developing. So I know my colleague Mary is going to dig in a little bit deeper on some of those, but that just kind of gives you a general sense of what our scope was and what our approach was. Thanks.
Thanks, Moki. As Moki mentioned, the work group's recommendations were informed by research and specifically a literature review that was conducted by Nancy Levine. So thank you to her, and really to figure out what existing evidence is out there on the operations and successes of alternative hotlines. So given our limited time today, we can't go into detail here and now on all the research findings, but you can find the research reports online at transform911.org. At the highest level, this review confirmed and really informed our efforts in several ways. First, there's not a whole lot of research out there on alternative hotlines. Most of it is related to 311 non-emergency municipal lines, and was conducted, sometimes up to decades ago, and primarily looked at outcomes in the first or second year of the alternative hotlines implementation. That being said, we do know the majority of 911 calls for service kind of continue to be for non-emergency and or human service needs, which indicated to us, a clear desire and need from community members for an option other than law enforcement or fire or EMS emergency response. The research results on whether hotlines reduce call volume to 911 are mixed. And again, there's more research to be done here to better understand and more accurately understand hotlines' impacts on 911 call volume. And despite providing a number other than 911 for individuals to call, the research showed that police continue to be dispatched to a share of alternative hotline calls. And this is something that we have flagged because, as Jerry kind of astutely mentioned this morning during the governance presentation, calling 911 is not a safe option for everybody. And alternative hotlines fill a critical role for community members who are making the deliberate choice to not call 911 because they would not like a police response to their crisis concern. And of hotline calls where law enforcement was dispatched, we're curious to better understand, did the call taker provide transparent information about the possible outcomes at the onset of the call? Was consent asked for when dispatching police? And did the caller explicitly request police response? There's more to learn on this piece. And finally, our research supports the idea that the effectiveness of hotlines, and particularly as we're considering their viability as an alternative to 911, depends on the public's knowledge of it, the expedience of response, and the quality of service. And ready for the next slide. Our work has also been informed by a listening session, which Moki mentioned earlier, which was with community-led organizations who are implementing non-police kind of autonomous responses to crisis in their communities. One of the goals of our work group has been to assess how alternatives to 911 could reduce bias and inequities in our criminal justice and health systems. And with that in mind, we believe it is critical to hear directly from organizations who are working on policing issues and alternative crisis response with their communities. And through this listening session, we learned of several concerns. Given that alternative hotlines fill a critical resource for people who have historically had adverse or traumatic experiences with 911 response, hotlines that send law enforcement without caller consent and or use geolocating services alienate individuals who could most benefit from an alternative to 911. Further, there were concerns around the centralization of the suicide prevention hotline and how the resources that are being used to kind of support the launch and rollout of 988 could potentially pull away from other important alternative hotline services. And we think those other hotlines should continue to exist and receive services or resources for folks to have options to choose from. And finally, we heard clearly that people deserve to know what might happen when they call an alternative hotline. Will the call taker be tracking my location or share what I'm saying with law enforcement? Is it possible that police might show up at my doorstep or that I may be taken to a hospital when I haven't asked to? These things matter, and transparency and confidentiality are important, particularly for those who have had historically adverse experiences with when calling 911. I'll turn it back to Moki. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we dive into the specifics of the recommendations, which are, as I think has been shared multiple times throughout the last few days, are works in progress. And, I think really, as we saw in the last session, really open for conversation and feedback. So, but as we dive into those specific recommendations, I just want to lift up some of our key findings and recommendations for discussion, excuse me. The first being centering the voices and input of those who've experienced unintentional harm or trauma by the current universal emergency response system. And I want to lift up here, that that 911 is the gateway to police response, and they are not the same thing, right? And so where there has been harm caused by police response, there is a need to really listen to communities about what that harm has meant for communities, and therefore how we should be changing our system, strengthening our system, and providing options across our system at every level, right? From the responders to how calls get triaged, to who takes the call, to who responds to the call, right? So we heard that when we had conversations with community members already. The second one was fostering a robust, well-marketed and transparent ecosystem of alternative hotline options, including those that are both directly connected to centralized emergency response centers and not, right? So just recognizing that, it may be human nature to want to create one perfect system that is all knowing and that is all connected and has all the technology, technological advancements of the age. And the reality is that we are already inside of a diverse ecosystem. And really the value add is making sure that people understand what exists across that ecosystem and continuing to provide a diversity of options, because that allows us to more effectively respond to the unique needs of particular communities. Right? The third was to identify 911 emergency calls for service that could be safely transferred to alternate hotlines. And, I will speak from the perspective here in Atlanta, that has been a big part of our work locally, is just to understand what the calls are coming into the 911 system, and just to recognize that, as I know folks are very familiar with on this and in this conversation, but just to recognize how many different types of requests and concerns are coming into the 911 system, how many issues the 911 telecommunicators are fielding, and that, because the system has become this catch-all, because we've all grown up hearing, see something, say something, call 911 for anything, there's a real need to understand at the local level, what are folks calling 911 for? And then where is it appropriate to start building out other ways for people to request services or share concerns that are not necessarily putting pressure on an emergency response system, which is what it was designed to do, right? Is to actually provide the emergency response. Number 4 is to be able to identify, invest in, or develop alternate hotlines that really have the capacity to respond to or to connect people to the available resources, right? So it's not just you're going to call a number and people, someone's going to tell you on the other end of the line, oh yeah, here's 3 other numbers you can call, right? But what we saw as one of the real strengths of some of the existing hotlines was a deep knowledge of the resources available, and then a personalized, the ability to provide sort of personalized support over the phone, as well as warm handoffs and immediate connections to resources, which is something that the 911 system is not designed to do because of the volume of calls, the urgency of calls coming in, et cetera. So just really supporting Hotline's ability to play that kind of role as a value add, as a part of this ecosystem that we're talking about. And then lastly, that this isn't going to be every hotline, right? This isn't going to be every option, but ideally the options that we have available include those that are cost-free, that are widely accessible, that do have the technological capacity that allows them to function well, that have enough investment in infrastructure to support high call volumes, to provide 24/7 support, those things that we have come to rely on as community members who can pick up the phone and call 911, that somebody will always answer the phone, right? And that it is not going to be overly difficult to communicate what you need and receive the appropriate resource. Like all of the investment that needs to go into making sure that 911 can do that effectively. If we want to include alternatives that can take some of the pressure off of 911, those kind of investments will need to continue to be made and newly made into alternative hotlines as well. So that, I know that was a lot, but we are just going to dive straight in to a little bit more detail on each of these. So bear with me, if you will. And please, I see we have some chats in the, some comments in the chat. Please continue to respond to these in real time, and then we'll really dig into them in the discussion portion. So thank you for that. So just to share with you directly what that first recommendation is. Again, when we're developing and implementing alternate hotlines, we really need the input of folks who have experienced an unintentional harm or trauma by the emergency system. There is, we want to acknowledge that we have seen really disparate outcomes for particular communities, including folks who are undocumented, people who have unmet behavioral health needs, people who are hard of hearing or have other disabilities, Black communities in particular, and other communities of color. And to the extent that that people have experienced harm, as well as sort of just unintended harmful consequences, right, of calling 911, it's really important that people are able to access alternatives that they feel better suits their needs, right, and is more comfortable to make a phone call to. And we see that oftentimes, that people are making those choices, kind of like Mary referred to, that people are choosing to call another number because they do have they have had previous experiences, or they are aware of the risk that the involvement of police response has resulted in. Next slide, please. All right, so the second one here is communities can respond to crisis situations best when they have robust, well-marketed, and transparent alternative hotline options, including those both directly connected and not, right, to centralized emergency response centers. So, I think what's critical here to lift up is that what we see is that the marketing and training for call takers of alternative hotlines should be designed to develop trust among partners and callers by promoting transparency in what to expect in the call, right? Really emphasizing that we should be communicating to callers what there is available and what may happen as the result of a call. And that kind of goes back to what Mary highlighted in some of the feedback we received about just wanting to really make sure that, if people are not calling 911 and that may be connected to not being comfortable with a police response, then we need to be really explicit with folks if we are, if there is an involvement or an automatic transfer to police dispatch, right? So just emphasizing the importance that callers can make informed decisions when they are calling these alternate hotlines feels very important. And then and then in terms of the connection to 911, having a streamlined process and protocols to receive and transfer emergency calls from 911 centralized emergency response centers to alternate hotlines for particular calls or service types. And that's a two-way street, right? That, you know, that there is sometimes the necessity for a hotline to transfer in or transfer over to 911, and it's just about making sure that that's clear to callers, and then having a clear protocol to do so. And similarly on the other direction, that when there are options in communities that the 911 call center can use in order to relieve their call volume, to try and kind of move out some of these non-emergency calls out of their line, or to move out crisis behavioral health calls, for example, that are more appropriate for a different response, but could start with tele support, as many of existing crisis lines do. Then there just needs to be really clear protocol so that it works well and is effective for the caller. Next slide, please. All right, and the third here, the shift of transferring particular 911 emergency calls for service that we would best served by alternate hotlines starts with community engagement, right? And it would be effective to, we think it's important to have a comprehensive gap analysis of what the service demand is, what the capacity of existing alternate lines are, or what the need is for those, and including an analysis of call for service data as one data type, right? There's more there, but it does feel important to be able to include those, and then to be able to streamline the collaboration between existing alternatives. I'm going to stop there. Jasmine, I think you probably have an additional comment on the third recommendation, and I don't want to step on your toes there. So I'll pass it over to you.
No worries, Moki, you could have just finished it. Hi, everyone. So as Moki was mentioning, the shift from transferring particular 911 calls of service to alternative hotlines would also include the streamlining of building on existing community resources by streamlining that coordinated collaboration. And this could be done through cross-system mappings of existing alternative resources already in the community. That would include info sharing. I've seen a lot of chats and questions and comments going about how would you market that, and educations to the community and educate the community, as well as developing some type of standardized tool that would help in assisting in evaluating those alternative hotlines. Also, on top of that, building on what we have already mentioned in the previous recommendations would also be understanding the gap of services to meet those needs of the community and to assist in the development and implementation of shifting those calls, particular 911 calls, to these alternative hotlines that do not traditionally need or require the traditional emergency response options that's initiated by 911. Next slide, please. So recommendation 4, the development and implementation of alternative hotlines should be equipped with the capacity to provide immediate access to and robust knowledge of available resources to offer personalized support broader and deeper than limited 911 emergency response options. In this recommendation, we considered providing that additional training options for alternative hotlines to focus on identifying the caller's needs, preventing and de-escalating an emerging crisis, and effectively advocating on behalf of the caller, which would include ensuring immediate access to needed resources and or community services in the community. More so, we also discussed the design of warm handoffs. What does that look like when completed by alternative response hotlines? That would be completing a warm handoff to community services and resources that would mitigate risk and provide more appropriate support than it is currently offered by 911 systems, which would include the ability to offer a follow-up call to the caller after the reported crisis has been resolved. And the last type of suggestion under this recommendation would be the ability for the alternative hotlines to have the capacity to deploy mobile alternative responses. That's especially in times of when an immediate response is required. And this could lead to the reduction of over-reliance on law enforcement response. Next slide. And the last recommendation that we are going to go over is the alternative hotlines that are cost-free, widely accessible, technology-driven, and an infrastructure to support high call volumes 24/7 will best serve as a viable alternative option to the universal 911 emergency response systems. And the highlighting points here during our work group was to include the creation of a safe and accessible option that includes multiple access points, such as the phone, text, chat, email, website, as well as access to interpretation services. I've also seen chats come through regarding this particular topic of how would we know in rural areas what is existing, how can we connect them if it's only phone-based. Those are topics and ideas that we've discussed in the work group, and this is one of our suggestions, is creating those multiple access points. Also, to increase the viability of alternative response hotlines through funding. Funding is a hot topic in our work group, because in order to have these alternative hotlines to function and aligning with 911, appropriate funding is necessary, right? And this option is to utilize alternative hotlines to be a more viable option to emergency response, is to offer it at no cost to the callers. That some suggestions came as, if a caller were to use a payphone or a cell phone service, would it operate the same way 911 does? So funding is a big issue to consider in these recommendations, as well as funding for operating 24/7 the way 911 currently operates. The current emergency response centers are 24/7 and sufficiently staffed or have the capacity to support calls for service during high 911 call volumes. Should you design, develop, and implement an infrastructure that could support those requirements? Again, going back to understanding the current gaps in demand and capacity when trying to implement alternative response hotlines. Next slide.
Okay, so the work of the Alternative Hotlines Work Group continues. And as we kind of continue to make sense of all that we've learned, and hopefully all that we'll glean from y'all who are here today, just to really further refine our recommendations, we wanted to lift up several questions that we think are important to dive into more deeply. How can alternative hotlines safely and systematically reduce volume of calls to 911 communication centers? So to truly serve as a viable alternative, then we need to be figuring out how to systematically reroute calls for service from 911 communication centers to alternative hotlines, and vice versa for some. So how can that be done? Where is it already being done? And what can we learn that could support other localities in doing the same? How does the immediacy of an alternative response, including initial access to a call taker and capacity for on-scene response, impact a hotline's viability as an alternative to 911? One of the most important characteristics, of the 911 system is the immediacy of the response. But, in consideration of this morning's conversation as well, that is not the only important piece. So it was great to hear from the governance work group earlier today as well, just elevating this as important, but not the whole picture. Particularly as 988 is rolled out across the country, how do we meaningfully invest in alternatives to support the expediency of the response while not compromising quality, as well as increasing the capacity for immediate on-scene support? To what degree do alternative hotlines reduce or increase racially disparate outcomes? This in part, returns to concerns that were raised by partners, the experts who participated in our listening session, really around caller consent and transparency by hotlines, particularly around law enforcement dispatch, privacy concerns, when and how an involuntary psychiatric hospitalization may be utilized, and other very critical considerations. And then finally, what are the relative costs, benefits, and potential savings of alternative hotlines? I will now turn it over to Mariela and Moki to move into discussion.
Thanks, Mary and Moki and Jasmine. So we're going to go ahead and move into the discussions and questions. We'll be using a Mentimeter platform as a way to capture your responses to the discussion questions on the slide. So for each question, we will put a link in the chat that you can click on. The link will direct you to the Mentimeter where you will see a place to enter your response, and then we will be able to see the responses coming in anonymously, and we'll reflect on what's being shared. So let's get started. The link for the first question is now in the chat, and Moki will be kind of helping me just facilitate as we walk and talk through these things. The first question is, are alternative hotlines a viable option to transform the existing infrastructure of the 911 emergency response system? Why or why not?
So we have an initial comment here that says, yes, alternative hotlines have different core missions that can meet the needs of the community. So something, something that kind of speaks to prioritizing, to getting the right shoe that fits, right? However, there needs to be have careful consideration, another person adds, just to ensure that there is, we have clarity about the intent and scope of the hotline's responsibility. Great.
People in crisis should have different pathways. So this is definitely something we discussed, right? Having different resources for different types of issues. Right party at the right time. It's huge.
That's right. We hear a concern here, and I think we saw something in the chat about the idea of the privatizing of public service. And that we haven't really incorporated that into the recommendations yet, but that is a conversation that came up especially when we were meeting with community providers and then talking about it as a group. So there is, absolutely valid question of, to what extent are alternate hotlines also public services versus private lines, and that makes a huge difference in terms of what expectations we can put on those lines, what we can require from those lines, and how they're resourced over time. So thank you for lifting that up.
Yeah. This one will come up pretty often in the conversations we've been having over the last year, right? To an extent, but we risk the danger of having a plethora of different numbers that people can't remember in an emergency. It may be better to expand the toolbox for different responses that 911 can send than different hotlines. This is something I think a lot of municipalities and governments are kind of working through. I think during the 988 conversation, this has come up as much as a lot as well, right? Which is that we've been embedded this 911 number forever. And what happens if you create a different number that, right? Other than maybe, and again, I see here 211, 311. That I think some people have started to kind of use a little bit more, but still can be confusing in an emergency.
Absolutely. And, I think what else we're seeing here is that, there are some public numbers that exist, right? And like we also saw in the chat during the presentation, there is such a challenge with marketing and community education, just really making sure that people understand what number is appropriate for what purpose. And also, though, that it doesn't necessarily need to be a both, it can be a both and, right? That 911 should be able to, which is another chat I saw in here, a comment, that 911 should be able to access these other resources as well, should people call them and there's a more appropriate resource available, but that there needs to be that community education, because that is a stumbling block for a lot of alternate lines.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see what else. The comment of there should be no wrong door in reaching out for help. Absolutely. And I think that, that has been an important part of the conversation as well, that, a lot of it depends on what callers are comfortable with, right? So we really are talking about choice here and ensuring that no matter what number people call, they are going to be connected to the appropriate response. These are great.
Mhm.
Great comments here. There's, sorry, I'm trying to catch up here, and then
I know, me too.
I'm
A little
losing
slower.
them. Yeah, thank you. I want to just lift up this one here in the middle about, you know, the use of 911 to resolve a conflict or complaint. And I just want to make sure I understand the comment that alternative hotlines center resolution around individuals who need service and deprioritize resolving a complaint. Got it. Thank you for lifting that up. You know, I think that if I'm understanding the comment correctly, you know, I think that kind of gets to some conversations that we've had about what actually is available when somebody calls an alternate line, right? That what we know is that 911 can be used and is often used by strangers, right? It's somebody who does not know the person that they are calling about. And the real benefit of 911 is that there will be an in-person response, right? Now, if instead the hotline that you're calling is just really, really great at offering telecommunicate, you know, teleresponse and providing resolution to the individual, but they are not able to send someone out, it changes the dynamic of who can call, right? And you can call about your loved one. Can you call about the individual who might be sleeping in your doorway? That might be a little more challenging. So thank you for lifting that up with an example. And I see we're, yeah, just reiterating this question of, you know, having dozens of numbers, right? That is certainly a challenge. And again, the question of privatization. You know, and I think one other thing to lift up here, and Mariela, I'm curious, or Jasmine as well, if you know, from your experience in Albuquerque, if there's something to speak to here of the pros and cons of doing things within the public system, because, you know, what we also, you know, what this process I think is really pushing forward is the need for the kind of professional development and support for 911 telecommunicators, to the extent that all of these hotlines are sort of standing up separate staffing. How do we ensure that the folks that are staffing those hotlines are also getting the appropriate, you know, just respect in the position, resources, training, et cetera? I don't know if Mariela, you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, it's you know, it's a very complex thing, because I think across the country we're seeing that most 911 systems are at capacity. I will say there's a piece of this that I think we've touched on this now through these questions, through this question around funding, right? So I agree that there's this idea around how are we funding this piece and how are we making sure that there's enough for even the alternative responses, but then there's also the support internally and externally, that I think both, right? We're now working with alternative hotlines here in Albuquerque from a community standpoint, but then still working within our 911 and 311 system. And there's just definitely a need for some coaching, for technical assistance, for you know, just additional resources for our dispatchers to have. And I think that this is the conversation I'm sure a lot of cities are having. And I think earlier on, there might have even been a chat question or prompt around like, how are we truly like identifying, well, and not competing, right? And that's what this really is about sometimes. But I will say from an internal perspective, sometimes working within our 911 system is really difficult, because for so long, habitually, we've had, you know, 9 like police or fire. And now as we're seeing cities who are creating all these alternative responses, right? Like ACS as a third option, it's really creating having to really push people to think critically. And sometimes you don't have that capacity after an 18-hour shift. So definitely some ups and downs from some of this, not just from a 911 perspective, but from even hotlines, and how are we also just self-caring for some of these folks and the vicarious trauma that they're taking.
So, thank you. It seems like there's a lot of alignment across the group, and or there's some themes. Let me say that there's some real themes emerging on this question, and some brainstorming here, which I appreciate. Just the acknowledgement of that we already do have. Most places do have, or many places do have, these other numbers available that are public numbers, right? 988 being, of course, the one that is taking drawing a lot of attention right now because of the process that it's in. I want to also just lift up that for rural communities, those resources, the public numbers may be a little bit more limited, right? The 311 in particular might not be as available for rural communities. And then also to lift up a comment in the chat from earlier of just the ability to access resources without a phone, right? And just ensuring that, that's also available. And sometimes our public numbers, may have better capabilities in that direction than our private ones. But then, it's kind of a mixed bag. So wanting to lift that up as well. And I just Maria, let me know what you think, how much, if we should move on to the next question in a moment, but I do want to lift up this other question of offering that fourth option, right? So, I know in Atlanta, you call 911, they say, okay, the person on the other line says, okay, you want police, fire, or medical. What does it look like to say, do you need police, fire, medical, or X, right? So I appreciate somebody lifting that up.
I think the last point I want to make on this, so sorry guys, fire alarm. I'll let Moki continue.
Got it. No problem. And yeah, I will speak to this, and then we'll see if Mariela is, hopefully it's just a test. So on the fire alarm, can you scroll down a bit on the Mentimeter to this question of 988? So I think this kind of goes back to marketing and community education, just being really clear with communities about what 988 is expected to do and what it'll have the capability to do. So just to lift up that comment there, that there is the expectation that they'll also be able to serve individuals with other social issues, not just suicide prevention. I wonder if folks have other comments on this. I do think that has been part of the conversation with 988 is that although that might be the vision going forward, that we want to be very careful to not overpromise what 988 is going to be able to do when it rolls out. And I think one thing to look at there is something that I referred to previously, which is just to what extent is 988 going to provide telephonic support before being able to provide first responders, and then how does that sort of change who can be served in that through that system, right? I think there was one more comment, if you can scroll up above, that I want to be able to lift up. And I love that. Thank you from Austin. Are you calling for police, fire, EMS, or mental health services? Which is a great example. And then if you can scroll up a little bit more, I just want to lift up this as the final comment, that for those calls that would still come into an ECC, 911 professionals need effective screening tools. So, I think that's something that we've also talked about, is just the ability, like what are the protocols and the standards and support then for 911 professionals to be able to identify when a call is a better fit for an existing hotline. And, that I'm sure is, on the top of everybody's minds with the rollout of 988, but even beyond 988, for there to be really strong triaging and screening tools to be able to get folks to the right option if it is not necessary, it doesn't necessarily need to be 911. All right. I think we should go ahead and move to the next question. if we can. I really, really appreciate all of these comments. I think we're gonna be able to really flesh out our recommendations based on these. So the link to the Mentimeter is in the chat here. If you can think on this question and share. How can alternative hotlines address and or resolve key systemic issues within 911 centralized emergency response centers? So we'll see what comes in here. And you know, I'll say for us in the committee or in the working group, I think there were times we had to sort of like keep coming back to that. We were not looking at hotlines just to understand them and explore, you know, what works well and what was a challenge within these hotlines. We, you know, our charge was to really look at these hotlines vis-a-vis 911. Right? Like to what extent they were going to impact for better or for worse, right? Like either complicate or resolve some of the key issues that we are seeing our colleagues really explore in this whole Transform 911 planning process. So great. So, you know, just real straightforward here, they can assist with issues that require response or assistance that 911 does not have available as a resource. Mm-hmm. Triaging to non-emergency services. Thank you for that. I see a comment here. Design across the senses. NLP for text and voice and automate such to optimize human resources and capacity. Yeah, so we're getting into sort of the technology piece, you know, to what extent that I'm making an assumption here, please feel free to put in the chat if this is wrong, but to what extent alternative hotlines are able to use technology wisely will probably be a big factor in their effectiveness. That's how I'm interpreting that comment. So I see a comment here that, you know, that by ensuring that alternative hotlines don't default to police response and protect caller anonymity when that's a caller's preference. And, you know, again, I think that is just a theme that we've heard over and over again, is that when somebody is choosing to call a different line, although we have all been, you know, it has been such a go-to to call 911, there is often the driver of that is that they do not want a police response, right? So we need to be really clear that if communities are saying that to us, if that is why often people may be using a line, then we need to be really careful about, that's an actual, that's a value add of these lines, and there's a way for us to protect that value there and to build trust with community members who choose to make those calls. And right here in the middle, you know, ideally, if the public knows their resources, the default won't be 911 for everything. And I will say, you know, based on our experience in Atlanta, we work very closely with the Atlanta Police Department, and, you know, with a lot of officers and with our lovely folks at the E911 Center. And we hear it all the time that, you know, they would love to figure out, like, how do we direct calls, how do we engage the community to really choose to call other resources when there are more appropriate. So we've heard that from a lot of law enforcement, that desire as well. All right, somebody's lifting up the question of response time, right? So just recognizing the way that calls coming into 911 maybe, you know, are triaged. And that, you know, what I see here is, you know, most low-level calls have response times of, you know, over an hour, right, for the person that's making this comment. So a value add could be a swift response when someone calls for service, and that would help reinforce their confidence in system responses. So thank you for that comment. I see a comment in the chat here that I want to lift up, which is the idea of it's entirely possible for a caller to tell 911 operator that they don't want a police response. Appreciate that. I think what we have seen, unfortunately, that there are also experiences in which that is requested and police are still to end up being dispatched. So I think there is sort of like, if there's a firewall between police response, that may be a reason for community members to choose to call another option just in order to avoid the possibility of error there. I see a comment here, and Mariela, I also saw you pop up there. So when you're back on, feel free to jump in, but no pressure. I see a comment here that, you know, that this person doesn't think that they will, right? Alternative systems operating tangentially with the established emergency response system will add complexity, reduce transparency, and divert resources. So, and absolutely a key consideration. You know, are we dividing resources from a shared pot? Or are we attracting new resources into this system? And just the question of complexity and transparency. Really appreciate you lifting up those concerns. Right. Let's see here. I'm sorry, can you scroll up just a bit? All right, so the question, I think, again, about governance, right? So I think it's fitting that we had this conversation earlier today about governance and what is needed to really support 911. That, you know, if we are also adding alternate hotlines into the mix, they may not necessarily be tied to the various kind of standards, right? Whether that's transparency or metrics, right? Or both, they may not be tied to that. And therefore there may be a challenge just in terms of accountability there. At the same time, what I'm seeing in this comment is that it may allow for more meaningful interaction for the alternate response or the alternate hotline to be able to stay on the phone with somebody. Right. And we heard from examples from many of our colleagues on the work group of, you know, of scenarios where it's like, you know, the call taker was on the phone with somebody for an hour, 2 hours, and that was what was necessary in the moment to really ensure the well-being and safety and the needs being met for the caller. Right. So that flexibility would, you know, I think is identified here as a value add. I think there's a concern about the ability to provide live services and response 24/7. You know, that it's really a capacity issue and a question of trust, right? So thank you for lifting that up, that it's, you know, on the one hand, it's community education, it's marketing about what is available, and then it's really being able to deliver on what people's expectations are. And right now we're operating a system where people's expectations are, I call 911 and someone shows up any day or night, you know, and that is a very high standard for alternate hotlines to meet, particularly if there are not dedicated resources, and you know, with the complication of both private resources or private lines as well as public lines being used here. Great. So another comment here about the call volume, just, you know, trying to reduce the call volume to 911 by having alternate options so that those calls are diverted before they even hit the system. Appreciate that. And I see here that I think somebody may be responding to the previous comment, but while some callers may say they don't want the police to respond, we have seen many instances nationally in which the police come, even when callers request EMS, and specifically that the police not be deployed, right? And of course, you know, the examples that we see, you know, are they may be the exception rather than the rule, but those exceptions we have unfortunately seen may come with a huge risk to the caller, and unfortunately have resulted in lethal consequences sometimes. So thank you for lifting that up. All right, let's see. Any other last comments on this that bring in a new theme here? I'm going to just, in that case, I'm going to end here with this comment in the chat, just saying, you know, alternative numbers require the public to triage complex situations, which may be inaccurate, thus delaying higher level of response. So, you know, I appreciate that concern with, you know, what responsibility are we putting on community members to have to decide what is the right call to make, right? And I think that, that's something that is certainly something that has come up, and probably looks different across communities too, depending on the resources available, and kind of might come right back to this question of community education and marketing at the same time as, I would lift up also the idea of just community engagement in designing this, right? Really wanting to hear from community members directly of, what options they would like, right? Because, I think there was an example shared about the idea of conflict resolution, right? That there maybe need to be additional options for resolving conflict. It's callers can know whether their fight with their neighbor over the pots in the driveway that are on their side and not the neighbor's, like, is that necessarily something that requires an emergency response? I think most callers could say no, but is there anywhere else to call to say, hey, I need mediation with my neighbor here, right? So just trying to recognize what percentage of calls might actually be triageable by community members versus those that are a little bit more complicated and might need a call to 911 to help figure out, or to another number. It looks like there wasn't actually a fire, Mariela, so that's good to see. I was thinking we might move on to the next question, unless there was anything else you wanted to lift up there.
No, and I appreciate I could hear everybody, but I couldn't find a spot. And I'm getting different information from Jasmine, good old Albuquerque. This is where 911, we need better communication, guys. But good. Yeah, now I'm ready to move on to the next question. I apologize for the interruption.
It's fine.
The next question was, how can alternative hotlines obtain/gain buy-in from other public safety entities? Ooh. Good question.
And in the meantime, I'd love to lift up a comment, by Susan, who's a member of our work group, has just offered a ton of perspective in our work together. But just to lift up that the alternative hotlines themselves may be doing a whole bunch of education around what they can be used for, what services they offer, et cetera, right? And so I appreciate you, Susan, for lifting that up. That although that could be more broad, it could be echoed by others, hopefully by other public entities as well. There is that benefit that that hotlines are doing the work every day, right?
Just to kind of start on this one, it looks like clearly defined missions and visions, processes, including public safety when appropriate, mission and goals. I love this ride along or listen along. I find it goes a really long way with folks. I early on when we were first talking about ACS in an iteration form, I spent weeks in the car with fire and police and dispatch. And what I found was that, like, in learning about their job, I would interject when I could to talk about, like, what would this feel like if you had XYZ, right? Like if you had a different response, or you had accessibility to somebody different, or a different line, or an expert in this area. And it was always amazing to be like, oh my God, like that would be amazing. It's like you had to paint the picture in the moment versus sometimes trying to start from the beginning and have people imagine, but to actually say, like, this is when we can, but this is walking the walk with us, right? And learning when you can have additional pieces, what that would look like. So I find that to be super helpful.
Can we scroll down a bit? Yeah, I think we've seen some comments here that echo some of the themes from that we've discussed already. So don't think I'm ignoring them. I just think we have we've captured some of this. So I appreciate that. I see here the comment that, public safety entities themselves could fund alternative hotlines to conduct activities that evaluate community needs and develop recommended strategies. So there could be some partnership there that would allow there to be some mutual solutions. That's thank you for that idea. Interesting. Also on the technology piece, being able to incorporate alternate numbers alongside 911 to the extent you can pop open your phone and you got the 911 app right there. Would you be able to do something like that for other resources? I'll lift up the sharing training materials and curricula. We are in conversations with our local 311 line and 911 line. And that's exactly what we're doing is, our team are the first person responders, or the in-person, I should say, responders to 311 calls for various codes. And what is really exciting about this partnership with 911 is the ability to cross-train, right? So 311 and 911 are already doing some cross-training, but specific to these codes that we're designing the curricula and the scripts together so that we make sure that we're not missing something that they would flag, and that they have an understanding of what we're doing and can have input on it. So appreciate that example. And also appreciate the start simple and be patient. It is a huge paradigm shift. And I think that's, that is a part of where we are in this entire conversation about transforming 911. An interesting comment here about the possibility for workers to go between hotlines, which I think really speaks to that cross-pollination and not being siloed, to be able to develop those relationships just within the people who are actually on the front lines doing the work. Great. I'm curious, for whoever put in the comment about cross-training having its own unintended consequences, would be great if you wanted to share in the comments more, if there's stuff that we should be thinking of and we could flag.
I really like that availability 24/7. I think that's huge, especially when you have alternative hotlines. It's hard to build up to that, but you're 100% right. At even sometimes at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning is when we see that there's a big need, and their only backup resource is 911. And I think there's even some ways to interestingly be creative around that. I will say that there's been in conversations we've had around how do we, if it's a call that right, someone says, I do not want police, it could wait until 7 in the morning, right, to give a little bit more description of what's happening, to then potentially say, right, can we call you in the morning? I know it's not always the most viable option for everybody at the moment, but again, there goes to this place. It's like, if we jump the call to say, okay, we need to send 911 immediately, it could, right, potentially end in a worse situation than if we waited until we could get that alternative response or that alternative hotline to be able to walk them through maybe that crisis. So again, it's an extra question sometimes that we have to ask.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. I think we have just a few more minutes left. I think we have one more question. What do you think, Mariela? Should we?
Yeah, the only thing I want to uplift in this area, which is really like, and I think this person that answered buy-in presumes the service being sold. Yeah, I think there's a piece of this separately that in conversations, sometimes having the data and having the funding, like the ability to say like what this might save, right? Our 911 system here in Albuquerque is at capacity. And so there is a conversation that says like, if we were to take, right, 20% or 30% of calls away, what would that feel like for your team who could then build capacity in other ways? Sometimes having that data and that funding conversation is like a really great starting point to at least ease into sometimes some of these conversations. So I'll leave it at that. And I say, yeah, perfect. So I think the last question we have is, how can alternative hotlines secure funds to build capacity and infrastructure to support high call volumes?
And I just want to offer one more comment as we're, allowing people to share their ideas here. To this question of just to piggyback on what Mariela has shared, I think the question of, whether we're or the concern about framing 911 as broken, I definitely hear that. And I think that we need to be very careful to talk about strengthening 911 and investing more in this emergency response system that so many people rely on, without saying, I don't think anybody's saying we are replacing 911 with alternate hotlines. I think what we're talking about here is choice. It's no wrong door. And it is ensuring, that that there are the most effective, appropriate resource depending on the need to reduce that pressure on 911 to be all things to all people. So we hear that concern, I think, and I think it will be important to make sure that the recommendations that we share and that the messaging that accompanies them is not in any way proposing that alternate hotlines are the solution to a broken system, as much as a necessary, that investment in more resources for community members to get what they need may help all of us. Let's see here.
Just to highlight some of what's coming up. So yes, federal level funding, huge. ARPA and COVID, that's a big one. Is how are we using that, and how are we being creative around using that?
Yeah, so the idea also of fee collection for alternate hotlines alongside 911. We have a comment here that there's the concern of government entities rating these funds, as may be part of the challenge today. But also I just want to acknowledge here that, similar to the current 911 system, that there is a wide range of, localized, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here, but of the way resources are deployed to be able to fund the local call centers, right? And the way that that requirements are laid out for these. So even if it's not, even if there's a range of public versus private numbers that people may call alongside or instead of 911, we're also dealing with an environment that is pretty different from place to place. And want to lift up a comment from Susan in the chat again, that many of the national hotlines are currently federally funded and legislated. And so there may be the necessity to allow more cross collaboration and consistency around requirements, funding levels, and how these resources, can be used and accessed. And it makes me think, Susan, that might be something that we want to include in our in the research that we also provide, or sort of the background information, just some information about what federal legislation and funding streams are currently being used for the various national hotlines. So thank you for lifting that up.
I do think there's an interesting place when we talk about funding around, right? Earlier, we talked about some of these alternative responses, some of these hotlines are very new. And I think it'll be really interesting in a year or 2 years as we start to see, right, the shift, hopefully, that we may see in calls to alternative responses and calls to, right, maybe 988 or hotlines. And then I think that's when there will be, in my opinion, a really interesting opportunity for us to then figure out, is it worth us to broadening out, right, the funding streams so that we can all have a chance to apply for them, right, when it comes to first responder models and hotlines and 911 services. Because I think that's, it's like, it's really a difficult conversation. We're talking about federal funding, because at what point, what pot do you pull from, right? Money has to come from somewhere. And I think, do we pull from behavioral health pots where we already know we're limited heavily, or do we pull from public safety pots where we also know that like there's a strain? So it'll be really interesting to see in a couple of years as data starts to show how these actual first responder new models and alternative hotlines are pulling from, right, are helping to build capacity.
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you for that. It looks like we should probably start wrapping up. I know it's been a long few hours, a lot of content. I really appreciate all of the comments that we're getting. I think we will absolutely bring this back to our group. And just to acknowledge and thank my my fellow co-chairs in this process. It's really been a pleasure working with y'all and all of the working group members that are on. Mariela, do you want to say last word?
Similarly, I just am so thankful that we've been able to be a part of this and able to meet so many amazing folks that are really pushing for just change, right? Change and doing better for our country and for our neighborhoods and our families. So looking forward to next steps. And so we'll go ahead and wrap up. And I will say, I think Jasmine might be the one
Hi.
jumping on. Oh, and then
Yes.
she is.
Yes, it's me. Sorry, everyone. So after the discussions over the past 3 days are the beginning of the next phase of this work. Over the course of the next few months, you will continue to make sense of the feedback and the work collaboratively to generate transformative recommendations. We invite you to continue to join us. You may learn more and contact us at transform911.org or email transform911@uchicago.edu. Thank you for joining us for this conversation and in the next phases of this important work. The research we discussed is available on the Transform 911 website, as are the recommendations shared today and over the past 2 days. Over the next few minutes, you'll hear from another 911 professional who will discuss the importance of this work and close out today's session. Thank you all for joining us today and participating in this conversation.
My name is Karina Putnam. I am a dispatcher at Valley Communications in Kent, Washington. We do this because it's the mission. We take care of vulnerable people, everyone, even the angry ones, the drunk ones, the ones experiencing something and they're not polite or friendly. We take care of them because we know that if we aren't here to do it, nobody else will be. We were here through the pandemic. We'll be here for the next thing. We'll be here for all of it, 24/7, all the time. We do that because it matters, the work matters, and the motivation behind it is always that, is take care of the people who need help. That is a high calling, and a lot of us feel strongly about making everything better for the next generation. And I'm excited about the changes to come. I can see an expansion for what we do now into something even more helpful, maybe more resources than just police or fire. And that's exciting to think about.
Many thanks to Karina and all the 911 professionals who shared their stories with us over the past few days, and for the 911 professionals and the alternative hotline professionals who are managing these calls and helping us access care nationally. We're also so grateful to all of you for joining us today, for the lively, engaging discussions and the wonderful feedback. I'm so grateful to the participation of the Transform 911 work group members, staff, and advisors, and to the co-chairs and speakers who so generously and successfully facilitated these conversations over the past 3 days. Thanks to Moki, Mary, Mariela, and Jasmine, who were literally managing fire drills during today's session. We thank you so much. and Jerry and Jeannie for joining us today, as well as Tyrell Morris, Chad Kasmar, Edwin Holstruck, Meredith Horowski, and Michael Coden for facilitating yesterday's conversations, and Laura Euland, George Rice, Sean Good, and Janelle Marcellus for facilitating the conversations on Monday. And thank you to our wonderful, skillful sign language interpreters from Joyful Signing who have worked with us and joined us over the past 3 days and share our interest in this work. Please join me in thanking the interpreters who have done a wonderful job over the past few days, and all of you who have joined us. Thank you. Your participation and your input has truly been a gift. Please continue to provide input on the draft recommendations at transform911.org recommendations, and please share that link widely with your networks. Any and all feedback is welcome. Thank you. We look forward to hearing from you, and we wish you all a well and safe evening and weekend. Thank you so much.